Hey everybody, this is Lydia.
Hello, this is Avery.
Hey, it's Catherine.
Welcome to our third and final session for PLIX CubeSats Online. We've had a great time with you all so far, and we're excited to do this today. Ooh, that was weird. Okay, so just a couple upcoming things. We'll be having PLIX community calls starting later this month, and another round of PLIX Urban Ecology Online starting at the end of the summer. You can RSVP with that link, and we will be coming out with the dates for the fall and winter workshops pretty soon. So stay tuned. Our agenda for today, a little welcome right now. Avery's going to give us a short presentation on tethered and high altitude balloons. We'll do an overview of this week's activity, break out like usual, and talk about how we may run this activity remotely for our patrons, and then get back together and share our ideas and wrap up. So thanks. All right, Avery, it's all you.
Great, so welcome back everyone for the third mission. As a reminder, this is the finale for the PLIX CubeSats activity series, and this is all about taking the design that your patrons or you have been working on, attaching them to tethered balloons, and ultimately collecting data and somehow using this data. So I wanted to first start off just by discussing the making prompts that everyone was able to complete on the forum over the last couple of days. The ultimate purpose of this was to sort of get acquainted with Scratch, which we love for a whole range of different projects within PLIX. And I have also found use for it in the CubeSat series. So we've used Scratch and microbits and other sensing capabilities to actually create payloads for various CubeSats. And so we just hope that this made you a little bit more comfortable or familiar with the program. I wanted to share out a couple of examples. So this one comes from Audrey. Audrey used the mouse tracking feature, and this little dinosaur tracks the mouse, and every time the mouse interacts with it, he flies into a new environment. And so I believe it was Audrey's first time working with Scratch, and so I think it sort of showcases that even as a beginner, you can use a bunch of cool features. You can make really amazing projects, sort of just starting out and using various tutorials online. So we love this project. I hope you all check it out. Again, it's in the forum post. Another thing we love about Scratch is, of course, the ability to remix. So on the left, we have an example that Lydia created using the microbit accelerometer sensor. And Dave actually contributed a remix of this. So you can actually remix the existing code, put your own particular spin on it, and basically create a new project. And so this is really helpful because you as a librarian can actually create a sort of template or an example project using Scratch. And you can give that to your patrons to remix in case they've never done Scratch before. And you'll see that patrons or anyone can take the prompt in many different ways, and you'll see a wide variety of results given your sort of template. And this is a very basic feature that you can do with a microbit. So using that accelerometer, so in the case of Dave's, the penguin might mimic a CubeSat, for example, and you can detect which way it's going. And you can use actually the microbits to do some more advanced sensing features. So if you are working with patrons or you yourself are a little bit more comfortable with data analysis or data acquisition, as a reminder, microbits have a bunch of built-in features. And Rachel showed this example which uses the microbits thermometer or temperature feature using something called MateCode. And this is it's sort of similar to Scratch in that it uses block codes, but you can also switch, sort of toggle on and off in JavaScript. And so it's a nice sort of gateway between using Scratch for programming your microbit and acquiring data, and then also using MateCode. With MateCode, you can also real-time visualize the data that you're getting. So when your microbit is on your payload or on your CubeSat up in the air, you can actually real-time see all the different sensor outputs in your local environment, which is super cool. So I'd encourage you to, if you haven't already, check out the forum. Still continue to post your examples. We're still looking at them. And I hope that you enjoyed this little making prompt. So for today's background discussion, we're going to talk about high altitude balloons and also tethered balloons as modes of experimentation and discovery in near space or on Earth environments. So I just want to review why space is difficult, or why it's really challenging to get to space, to explore space. And so here's a bullet point list. I'm not going to go over all of them, but just some things to keep in mind is that it's really expensive to go to space. Launching a rocket costs a bunch of money. Once you're in space, it's really difficult to communicate. There are extreme space environments, vacuums, extreme temperatures, micrometeorites, different types of radiation that impose threats to your CubeSat or any space body, really. And then you also have to think about things like licenses and regulations. So one of the hardest parts about getting something into space is actually the paperwork and navigating the sort of bureaucratic pipeline to get communication processes up and running, to get that downlink of data up and running. And so while all of these things, all of these factors, all these variables, we think that we can only test these really once we're in space. But it turns out that we can actually use different tools on Earth to make sure that our hardware is space ready. And this is where balloons come into play. So we're going to discuss a couple of different balloons. The first is a weather balloon. Weather balloons range in size. So you'll see in that GIF on the left, it's like a sort of very large party balloon, but they can get as large as football fields, basically. Weather balloons are also called high altitude balloons for the reason that they go extremely high into the atmosphere, upwards of 50 miles, and they technically enter near space. So that image on the right is a picture of Cape Cod in Massachusetts, actually. But this balloon took this image in space, and you can sort of see the horizon there that this, in fact, is going very, very high. And so what happens at this point is that you begin to experience some of the challenges that we described in the last slide. So there are some environmental factors. You have to think about communication, tracking of your payload. And ultimately, you're testing out, does your payload continue to function as it sort of goes very, very high into the atmosphere? Are you still able to generate data? Are you still able to downlink the data? Can you get pictures at a resolution that you're happy with? So these weather balloons, or high altitude balloons, are a very legitimate form of experimentation that people do when they want to test something before launching into space. And this is very, very common by NASA. So again, they have much larger weather balloons. This one is only partially inflated, so you can imagine that it gets, like 5 or 6 times this size. And NASA runs very cool experiments using weather balloons. Here are 2 examples. So on the left, NASA launched a 5-day flight weather balloon, so it was in the air for 5 days, to track these electric blue clouds. And these are very particular clouds that only appear for a couple of days throughout the year in the upper atmosphere. They result actually from interactions of ice crystals with micrometeorites and create this literally blue clouds that are very cool to see. And this would only be possible to see with weather balloons. NASA is also using weather balloons for biology experiments, and this is something called the Aerolab. And so they have these payloads where it's biological samples that are exposed to the air. And this is because they're testing the near space environmental factors on these biological samples. And again, they're doing this without having to send it to space. A balloon can be expensive, but ultimately it's a lot cheaper than a rocket launch and getting your CubeSat into orbit. But you're still able to answer some of those scientific questions and also able to test out some of the on-Earth or augment that on-Earth testing that you're doing with your payload. Here at MIT, we've also done some experiments with weather balloons. This is a project that is a partnership between something called BeaverCube, in which a class of MIT undergraduates are building a CUBE satellite that has a NASA-confirmed launch, excitingly, that has a partnership with the Media Lab Space Initiative. And so they were using weather balloons specifically to just test out different cameras to see which one would be optimal to put on their CUBE satellite. So the left is a Raspberry Pi camera, which we actually discussed last time. And you can see that the resolution is fairly high. And then the image on the right is a boson thermal camera, which is like a $5,000 camera. intended for infrared imaging. And the ultimate purpose here was to see which of these tools works better for imaging ocean surface. So there's another type of balloon, sort of a step down cost-wise from high altitude balloons. And these are tethered balloons, and sometimes they're also called aerostats. Tethered balloons have some distinct advantages when it comes to thinking about high altitude balloons, and the main factor being the cost. There's actually a global helium shortage, which we'll get into, but anytime something requires a smaller amount of helium, the cost is going to be dramatically lower. But with that in mind, you can also run these experiments more frequently. So if you have a payload that is in the earlier stages of development, you can think that this would be a great purpose to use it for. Tethered balloons also eliminate some of the variables that are related to a space environment, so extreme temperatures and vacuum and radiation. But at the same time, you can still test a bunch of the important factors like communications, mechanical stress or integrity. You can think about different power systems and if your payloads have enough powers at all times. And also related to the environmental factors is like the high speeds. So can your tethered balloon withstand the impact of all the different wind speeds? And the GIF on the right is just an example of a tethered balloon for communication purposes being deployed in Antarctica. Some other examples of tethered balloons. The image on the left is by a company called Thales, and they use tethered balloons for real-time crisis tracking. So, for large-scale things like floods and hurricanes, we need satellite imagery. But in terms of actually tracking people on the ground, triage and things like that, that aerial imagery can be super helpful. On a more scientific side, on the image on the right, I'll shrink this real quick. Tethered balloons are actually used to sense the atmospheric changes around volcanoes when they erupt, which is pretty cool. Again, because you can't really get anything like a drone or people close to that environment. So you can use tethered balloons to actually get your payload as close as you can to the volcanic surface and that interface where it's erupting. And again, so sort of like the high altitude balloons, we can use tethered balloons as a great way to experiment with our payloads and carry out important scientific missions. So this will lead us to the mission 3 description. Again, this is liftoff. This is all about the balloon deployment and data collection. Oh, and this image here is the balloon launch that we did on the MIT campus using a 2U cube satellite. So a brief overview. The intro, sort of like we just discussed, will be a brief overview of balloon missions, but more importantly, just going over the safety briefing and how to sort of maintain a safe environment as you're putting these CubeSats up in the air. The main activity will, of course, be deploying the model cube satellites, and you'll have a come-together discussion regarding the data collected and ways in which you want to follow up or curate your data, perhaps for an exhibition in the library or an exhibition online. So a couple of tips related to this mission. And the first relates to selecting a launch site. And this is both on the sort of scientifically interesting side, but also thinking about safety. So the first thing that you'll want to do is to check in with necessary permissions or safety regulations in your area. For a tethered launch, there is very likely not going to be any permissions required, but you just have to make sure that you're doing it in a place where you can maintain a safe boundary with people. So we found that we did it, or doing it on the library grounds in our Cambridge Public Library playtest to be super helpful. There was a bordered off area which we could sort of control access to so that people weren't coming off the streets and sort of asking, oh, what's going on, and getting hit with CubeSat debris. So again, we did it in a tennis court, but the main thing you want to think about is this adjacency to nearby buildings and trees and telephone poles. You really don't want to get your CubeSat stuck in a tree. Trees are really good at cutting the line of your tether, so you'll ultimately end up losing your CubeSats most likely. You have to think about weather as well. So a healthy amount of wind is good. It can actually help lift your balloon off the ground, especially if you have heavier payloads. But too much wind will sort of make your payload uncontrollable, so you want to think about that. The tip I use is just like, if you're comfortable outside, if you're having a great time and your body feels good, then ultimately it's a sort of good weather conditions for your payload or for your weather balloons as well. You also want to think about where exactly you're launching in terms of, is there enough information here? Is there enough data that you can collect if you're doing aerial imagery? So you can think of things like vacant lots are pretty interesting. Our tennis court was interesting if we're in an urban setting. So you can also work with your patrons to choose which launch sites that they'll think is interesting, depending on the payloads that they're designing. This is what happens when your CubeSat it's stuck in a tree. I will say that in my experience running these activities, kids especially can be really excited. They like want to get their payload stuck in a tree. So design your experience such that this can't happen, because eventually we did lose this payload. This is that same balloon launch pre-tree encounter. So learn from my mistakes and go farther away from the tree. But I just wanted to give a quick example launch site. So we ended up choosing this site because there was a combination of both paved surfaces and also vegetation. In this case, we were super interested in using an infrared camera for imaging vegetation. And so I think it's just important to work, again, with your patrons to think about the payloads that they're developing, if it's imaging, if it's data sensing, where will be interesting to collect that data. Safety and operations. And thanks, Lydia, for posing for this photo. We love it. So this launch activity works best with at least 2 facilitators. And this is because you ultimately want one person that's in charge of the tether and slack. That is someone putting the balloon up into the air and taking it back to the ground. And another person to sort of mediate the process of getting the CubeSats from patrons and attaching them to the balloon, and also supervising the patrons during deployment. And so once the balloon is in the air, there's always that possibility. Again, this is a test, so you're testing the mechanical strength. It's possible that the CubeSat can come apart, that things become loose and fall off. So we really encourage you to create some kind of safety perimeter. You can do this doing like a chalk perimeter, or using a fence, or using cones to denote some sort of outline. And just putting together like a quick safety kit or rapid emergency equipment to have on hand kit. So like having safety goggles and gloves and zip ties and scissors on site is pretty necessary. So some other fun tips and tricks. In terms of balloon selection, you can use any type of balloon basically. So if you have balloons on hand, that's great. This example image is actually from the Ballarat Public Library, who ran this programming, and they use really cool emoji balloons and heart balloons. And so that's great. And you can use those sorts of things to make it more playful. And in fact, mylar balloons, which are pictured, are a lot more beneficial or ideal than rubber balloons because they're a lot lighter weight. They ultimately require a lot less helium. Again, thinking about that global helium shortage, it's best to design the payload or mission in a ways that uses as little helium as possible. Again, having some other supplies on hand is super helpful, including zip ties and carabiners for easy addition and removal of the CubeSats. Going back to that CubeSat helium cost, you can fill about 3 large mylar balloons that span 4 cubic inches for about $100. In our various play tests, this has been more than enough to lift 1 to 2 CubeSats with pretty significant payloads at a time. Another tip is to make a run of show for the session. And so basically, when you start to launch the balloons, patrons will get very excited. They'll want to put theirs next. They'll want to spend 10 minutes with their balloon and deployed. So it can be helpful as a facilitator ahead of time to make a run of show. So scheduling the time slots in terms of order, but also duration of this, the flight. And also thinking about, if you're sort of pressed for time, which payloads can be flown alone versus with others, depending on their weight and depending on the method of data collection. So we've never run this one at a distance, of course, before, but we wanted to provide you with a couple of ideas. So I can't remember who it was, but someone actually in the first session suggested this, which is dropping off, having patrons drop off their model satellites at the library for launch, and then the librarian ultimately remotely runs this launch process and data process and reports back to their patrons. You can also set up analog missions at home. It's not as exciting as the ultimate tethered balloon launch, but you can do things like setting up a zip line or a rig, sort of like Dave showed in his forum post this week, to set up a launch site that will still elect you to collect data or experiment with your mode of art making or microbit sensing, but in a way that is a lot less resource heavy. You can also sort of plan ahead. I know that we're entering, well, soon we'll enter the winter months, so you might be thinking about running these in the spring. But in the meantime, you can work with your patrons to have virtual exploration sessions to choose interesting field sites or make a repository of field sites and thinking about the regulations that you'll need for running the activity in your local area. So with that, I will hand it over to Catherine, who will describe the breakouts for you all.
Hey, yeah, so just like normal, we're going to be hopping into the breakout rooms now. They'll open up shortly just below this window, and you can feel free to join any room that has space. We'll also be hopping in there to participate in the conversations, because it's one of our favorite parts of these workshops. And yeah, we'll be back here in about 20 minutes. So see you all there, and thanks.